To talk about them a little this evening, we've invited James Michener, the author, to come onto the program from Austin, Texas, because his book, to a great many Americans, captured the feeling and the sense of the people in the space program. Mr. Michener, thank you for joining us. Talk to us a little bit, if you would, about the people in the space program.
I received some criticism in my novel Space because the great effort that I focus on at the end ends in tragedy. It aborts on the moon, the two great heroes are left there, and one man is left with the sad job of bringing the ship back home. People said, why did you have to do that? Well, I had to do it because any man with common sense, looking at this great program of which I had been a part for many years, knew it could always have happened. As a matter of fact, it did happen right at the beginning with those three wonderful young men, Grissom, White, and Chaffee. But the program went on. It was only 2 years after Chaffee and his friends died in that tragic accident that men were walking on the moon. And I think that's the lesson of today, that we have lost 7 wonderful people, one of whom was a good friend of mine. This has hit me with terrible force, but only as an example of what we live with in almost everything we do. The capacity for tragedy is always there, right at the edge.
And the danger, of course, is always there for people who live on the edge. The people we've talked to today, Mr. Michener, have often been very closely identified in a professional way with the space program. Through your research, I know you spent a great deal of time with these people. What is it about them that leads the rest of us to invest so much in them and often place so much of a burden on them as national heroes?
I think with great affection of many of the astronauts I've known, and I'd like to make one point clear tonight. I've talked with them for many hours, and I have never heard the word fear mentioned. They don't sit around and brood about what would happen if I get into this crate and something happens. They know what would happen. It's part of their lives. They've accepted that 15 years ago when they wanted to become a test pilot or wanted to become an astronaut. They live with fear constantly, but they do not let it dominate their lives. I have never heard an astronaut speak of fear, nor would I ever speak of fear to them. We were talking about machines. We were talking about procedures. We were talking about the inevitable chances that all men take. Theirs were more grievous, I think, than some. But these were young men, and I knew 2 of the women very well and loved them, really. They were just magnificent people. And we talked about the professional problems. We talked about the next flight. Always there was the knowledge that this was a very difficult profession they had gone into. There was a dignity about it. There was a wonder. There was a feeling that they were on the cutting edge of life, and they wouldn't have been anywhere else.
Mr. Michener, I detect, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that what you're saying in favor of the manned space program as opposed to the purely technological one, as we've seen in Voyager 2 out in the heavens this week, is the question of judgment and touch. Is that right?
If you read the latter part of my book, Space, you will see that I pay a great deal of attention to that great debate between manned and unmanned space effort. I personally came down in the book slightly in favor of the unmanned, of sending the great machines out to see what they could do, just as yesterday the machine at Uranus sent us back such a remarkable bit of information. However, I knew from the beginning that in the United States, the space program had to have men and women in it to focalize what we were doing, to epitomize what the space program meant for human beings. And so I subdued my scientific bent and said, okay, if we have to do it with men more than perhaps we should, that's the rules of this game. And I was willing to live with it. Tonight, I think you phrase it very well, Peter. I'm absolutely 50-50. I see the virtues of each. I think each is necessary, and I expect to see each move forward with great triumphs for the rest of this century.
Mr. Michener, thank you very much for joining us this evening from Austin, Texas, and making such, as always, a thoughtful contribution. James Michener, the author in Austin, Texas, making the point so many people have made today. It's one of the reasons we fly the flag at half-staff all over the nation. Here in the Capitol tonight, at the White House, and in small and large communities all over the country, because the adventure in space without man and without Americans is clearly incompatible with the national character. When we come back, we'll talk again to one of those astronauts, Deke Slayton. We'll also have some thoughts from George Will. We'll be back in just a moment.
ABC News coverage of the Shuttle disaster in space continues in a moment. After this message from your local stations.
Try to give you some indication of how the news today hit Washington like a thunderbolt. A number of us, reporters, were at the White House this morning waiting to see President Reagan, who usually on the morning of a State of the Union address calls in reporters from around the country, the networks and the newspapers and the wire services, to talk about his State of the Union message. And in the middle of that meeting, as we waited for the President to come into the dining room, a message was handed in the door to Don Regan, the Chief of Staff, saying, the shuttle has exploded, details to follow. We all fled from the room, obviously. And shortly thereafter, as some of you may know, the President canceled, postponed his State of the Union message, which will now be given a week from today. And the White House and Congress, but the White House particularly, has just felt the burden of this national tragedy very deeply. Here's our White House correspondent, Sam Donaldson.
The flags went down to half-staff all over Washington as the shock set in, from the White House to Capitol Hill.
This is truly a national loss.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends.
The House of Representatives paused for a moment of silent prayer, and elected officials tried to make sense of what had happened.
I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning, that the answer to that is no.
God moves in mysterious ways, I guess from time to time to remind us of what mortal beings we really are, and that everything isn't all that sure.
The Washington day began on a note of pleasant expectation. The President would give his State of the Union message tonight, and his mood as he briefed congressional leaders on it was clearly upbeat.
Now that the Super Bowl is over, I can really say, welcome back. And Tip, I suspect the results were not all that you would have liked.
It was like the first year of your term, Mr.
But at 11:40, when the President received the news, the upbeat mood changed. Mr. Reagan watched the television replays horrified. He told reporters he was shocked and saddened, but that the State of the Union speech would go on. You can't stop governing the nation, he said. But within an hour, that had changed. The pictures were too horrible. The shocked reactions from families and school children too emotional.
The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred.
So the speech was postponed until next Tuesday night, leaving time for reflection and also the first assessments of the space program's future.
Well, it's going to have an adverse impact upon the whole space program. There may be delays that could go on for as much as a year with regard to future shuttle launches.
They were under tremendous pressure, especially in this very, very busy year. And I think that NASA was under pressure from its commercial customers to deliver and to deliver on time.
I think that some limit has to be placed on the PR that NASA indulges in before they proceed with their launch. I'm not opposed to an occasional civilian, but it seemed to me there ought to be some educational or some scientific purpose in their journey.
But at the White House, the president seemed to reflect the majority view of what's ahead.
I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
There'll be hearings on Capitol Hill next month as the Congress and the administration take a look at the space program in light of what happened today. They'll examine the timetable, the question of manned versus unmanned flight, among other things. But there seems to be no inclination in the Capitol tonight to give up. The space program will go on, as the president said, bloodied but unbowed. Peter?
Sam, we both know that the president has an incredible capacity to comfort the nation at times like this. I thought today he was as eloquent as I'd ever heard him. You tell me from your own perspective why you think this Capitol stopped so suddenly today.
Well, it stopped because it was shocked. It's never seen anything like this before. As many people have already said tonight on your broadcast, Peter, it had gone so well. The space program had gone so smoothly. People, except on one outlet, didn't even have the opportunity to watch the space program. The major commercial networks had not carried the launch for a long time. And so when it happened, it was like something that shouldn't have happened occurred. We're used to terrorism now. When the next word comes that another plane has been hijacked, we're all going to be horrified, but we will have expected that. No one expected this. And like human beings everywhere, they just came to a halt.
Sam Donaldson at the White House, thank you very much for a very long day.